Welcome everyone to the first session of the Practitioner track at the Montreal ISF. I'm Mike Gilliland. I'm editor of the journal Foresight, our Practitioner journal, and I want to welcome those of you who have some free time at 4 o'clock today. I'm doing a session on how to publish in Foresight, so I hope to see some of you there. Today I'm introducing Dr. Mark Chockalingam. Mark is president and founder of Valtitude. It's a strategy and solution consulting firm based out of Boston. He has over 20 years of consulting and corporate experience in the areas of predictive analytics, sales forecasting, supply chain optimization, and integrated business planning. He's worked with clients ranging from the Fortune 500 to small and medium-sized businesses. During his corporate career, he's worked in supply chain positions at FedEx, at Merck, Procter & Gamble, and some others. And he edits the forecasting blog and frequently writes about emerging demand planning and supply chain issues on LinkedIn. Mark has a PhD in finance from Arizona State University and is a member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. So, I just hear the bio introduction, and then I hear the words 20 years. So I always keep it at 20 years. So, don't want to say how many years of actual experience, given that we are all aging, right? So I'm blessed to be here speaking again. So this is the clicker, right? So basically, we were actually worried about AI. I think all of us are. Practitioners are. People who are not worried about AI are the ones who do not use AI and they don't know AI exists, right? So which is good. Ignorance is bliss. So what we did was we said, okay, well, naively as practitioners, let's test what AI can do. Throw a bunch of data and then see how it performs, and particularly client data, right? We have harmonized the data a little bit and how it's used in other practical applications. So we use quite a few practical forecasting software applications. So we do a lot of work in SAP APO. I know some of you know about SAP APO, and SAP IBP, which is the current version upgrade to the SAP APO. And then a variety of other forecasting software platforms like Anaplan, Kinaxis. Kinaxis is not specifically forecasting, but it's an end-to-end supply chain planning platform. So our hypothesis was, let's just throw a bunch of data, particularly client data, and test what the results are, how easy it is to produce forecasts. Really, we started with the large language models. So the question that we were trying to answer is two fundamental questions. Will AI replace forecasting software packages? Because we have a lot of commercial software packages, and there are forecasting applications within large enterprise planning platforms as the ones I mentioned, SAP, APO, IBP, etc. So commercial packages, we have Forecast Pro, Eric Stelwag and Sarah Darren are in the room. And there are variety of competitors, right? Smart software is there, so lots of commercial packaging, software packages are there. So given that AI or LLMs have digested all of the information produced by the good people of IIF, right? Academic researchers, if you just attend these sessions over the next couple of days, 3 days, right? There are competing academics, like very, very good presentations as well. 20-minute presentations, lightning presentations on the frontier of forecasting, right? Lots of knowledge you can get from here. So all of it is publicly available. They're all published. So the hypothesis is LLMs have swallowed, digested all these models. That's open source. The technique of best fit, right, or best fit methodology, that's also open source. So they have really consumed all this, so which means they should be ready to provide good forecasts. Just you ask the question, and tell us, okay, give us the best forecast, right? That should be possible. So if that's the case, then does it make software, commercial software packages redundant, right? Will they go out of business? And the second question is, if AI is so good, LLMs are so good, and then we have agentic AI, which is very popular now. Agentic AI is the hottest thing this year. Of course, Claude is hot, agentic AI is hot. So with agentic AI, the propositions that we see from variety of corners is that agents can actually do the forecasting themselves. We could have a demand planning agent, we could have a supply planning agent. So agents can pretty much run corporate America, right? So if that's the case, will agents make agentic AI and LLMs that provide the agentic AI, will they make demand planners at risk as well, or demand planners at risk of losing jobs, right? So that's kind of like the hypothesis of this. So we tested a bunch of LLM models, and also we tested foundation models. I think you will hear a lot about foundation models over the next couple of days as well. So the ones that are freely available is what we tested. Just to keep it unbiased, we used the free versions of the LLMs only, right? Not the paid version. Of course, we are using paid version now. Just to keep it unbiased, we use the free version. So, you probably have heard of all of these models, right? You've heard of, Claude is hot. Almost everybody would be using Claude. Either you're using Claude or ChatGPT. If you're using ChatGPT, you are still in the last year, right? So you haven't heard of Claude yet. So Claude from Anthropic, ChatGPT from OpenAI, Gemini, which is from Google, and Microsoft Copilot, which is probably in everybody's machine, and it's also useless. Then you have Grok, Perplexity, and Llama, right? So these are all the broad LLMs that are available commonly. And then for foundation models, which I heard a lot about over the last few months, so we decided to test the foundation models as well. The premise on foundation models is zero-shot forecasting. You don't have to do anything, no tuning, nothing. Give the data, it produces the forecast, the best fit forecast. And surprisingly, the results were pretty decent with foundation models. As far as I know, these are freely available. Chronos 2, Chronos Bolt, both from Amazon. Chronos 2 is a later version of Chronos. Like there was Chronos, then Chronos Bolt, then we have Chronos 2. And then Times FM is from Google. There are also other foundation models that we are not aware of. There is one from Nixtcloud, but I think that we have to pay for it, right? I don't think there is a free version available. So we did not use the Nixtcloud. I think it's called TimeGPT, if I remember right, TimeGPT. So we did not use that. And then to benchmark, we used a commercial package running ETS, right? Basically, Holt Winters, Arima, standard classic models. And we also just compared it with the supervised AI model also. So just to level set, to understand the foundation models, we level set with the very popular airline passenger traffic data set from Box Jenkins, right? So it's a very classic, predictable, looks very predictable data set, right? It has trend and seasonality over time. So, anybody can predict this even without a model, right? So basically, when we just tested the foundation models just for level set, because I didn't know what the foundation models can do, so we just started with this. The presentation would be available later on, I believe, right? On the web, right, Mike? This presentation will be available to everybody, right? Yeah, okay, all right. So foundation models, I don't have to tell you about foundation models. Most of you are experts. Essentially, what we found, Chronos 2 and Times FM did better. Chronos Bolt was not that great. Obviously, that's why Amazon went with Chronos 2, which is an upgrade over Chronos Bolt. Chronos Bolt had issues forecasting seasonality, either under forecasting seasonality or over forecasting seasonality. So, but Times FM marginally edged out Chronos 2, right? And TimesFM is also a free foundation model that's available from Google, right? So as you can see, over the 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month holdout periods, TimesFM did better. So did Chronos. Not much of a difference. This is all weighted MAPE. So throughout this presentation, we are not using anything probabilistic. We are not, talking about CRPS, that type of stuff. It's all weighted MAPE, right? Weighted MAPE is essentially mean absolute deviation over the mean, right? So it's just weighted MAPE is what we are using across the board. So easy to scale, easy to report. And then we also use a second measure called normalized root mean square error. So root mean square error is a number, so we just normalize again with the mean. So it is something that we can compare. So there is a percentage comparison that you could make. So using both measures, you can just see TimesFM and Chronos 2 did pretty decently, right? So very low errors. Even over the 24-month holdout period, they were doing pretty well. Okay? So if you look at it, just a graphical representation of how the foundation models did with the airline data set. So given this, what we did, we actually only selected Chronos 2 and TimesFM in the final run to compare with the LLM results when we actually tested client data sets. So we took a couple of client data sets, anonymized it, and then ran it. So since these are free versions, we just wanted to make sure that there is no risk here, right? That's the reason why we anonymized the data set. Okay? So we created, the data set overall looks like this. So if you look at it, this is a business that was growing initially, right? And then after time, because they had other competing categories that they introduced as well as the competitors introduced, then the business actually started softening a little bit, right? They're still doing pretty well. Now they have stabilized in this category. So we picked this, and we gave this data set that has what looks like seasonality to a certain extent, and also has an inflection through the data, right? Through the time as we see from 2021 through 2023, it peaks, and then it just drops off. So what we should expect is either a declining forecast or a stabilized forecast towards the end, right? That's what we should expect, with some seasonal patterns. So this is what we tested. And we also tested other data sets that don't really have this type of an inflection point as well. So really, we subsetted 30 SKUs, but then we expanded it to another data set that had 1,000 SKUs as well. The results didn't change. Largely, they didn't change. Okay? So initially, it was all very naive, right? It was just baby steps. We said, well, we don't know anything about AI. We just give the data, just do the prompt, sit back, relax, and see what it does. So first pass with that type of prompting, just load the data, ask the question, give me a forecast. They did not do well. All the LLMs, most of the LLMs, they did poorly. In fact, they all looked like they were in love with the profit model. So most of the LLMs, believe it or not, invariably they picked the profit model. So Claude also picked the profit model. So this is the result from Claude. And the forecasts were really highly exaggerated forecasts. So, and then when we said, hey, these look very exaggerated, the peaks are pretty high. So what Claude did, it apologized and said, yeah, you are correct. And then it trimmed the peaks, right? And that is the second version. Now, this is actually obviously based on the data that we passed before the inflection happened, right? So it was a growing series at that point. So we cannot trick, if there is an inflection that's coming, we cannot trick LLMs or any model for your information to say, hey, predict the future when I know the future is going down. But obviously, based on historical past, they're going to have an uptrend in the forecast, right? So it was kind of funny that Claude came back and said it chopped off all the heads and then said, hey, that's your forecast. It's going to be flat, right? So GPT, same thing. GPT-5 also selected the profit model, right? And then Copilot and Gemini, They did not use any machine learning models. They used ETS, right? They just used either ARIMA or Holt Winters, that type of stuff. And then they also, came up with forecasts. But it was really difficult to get a forecast file out of Copilot and Gemini, right? Even after several prompts, they wouldn't give you a file. They'll give you instructions. So then we did detailed prompting, and then we had to resort to Google Colab to get some results out of Gemini. Because the ordinary prompting in Gemini did not give us any forecasts, basically, or forecast files. It'll forecast maybe one SKU. That's what ChatGPT did as well. They gave forecasts for one SKU, and then they gave detailed instructions, pedagogic instructions for us to write the code and run the model. They gave code, obviously. So, this is like one of the results from Gemini as well in Google Colab, right? Now, with Google Colab, it's not exactly LLM. It's not exactly AI, right? Because you really have to kind of tune it, interact with it, that type of stuff. So you have to be a modeler. You have to be a statistician to use Google Colab. So essentially, when we compare the four different ones, at least the ones that we tested initially, Grok, Perplexity, Llama did not give any results at all, right? They basically, maybe the paid version may give you results, but they did not give any results. So typically, as I said, Google Colab, it needs fine-tuning, it needs interaction with the human, an expert modeler. Claude did best compared to all of them, right? ChatGPT, it's capable, maybe the paid version would work well, but the free version, as I said, just picked profit model, forecasted one SKU, and then gave up on the others. They said, no, we cannot do anything. You have to upgrade. Copilot, really was very dismal performance. Copilot, I don't know what your experience is. I would say Copilot is not a forecasting tool. Even others, I think we have had mixed experience with Copilot. Claude did pretty well. Selects and executes forecasting models automatically. Good presentation skills, excellent visuals, so which means you can develop an agent that will do everything, from data cleansing to model selection to graphical outputs, as well as comparison tables as well, holdout sample methodology with different metrics. So also good logical reasoning. So Claude is like very, very good, right? With Claude, it seems like, with a little bit of experience with Claude, you could actually automate the forecasting tasks. So we developed detailed prompting with Claude, right? So some of the practical limitations that we had, we decided to just really ignore, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Grok, all of that in the final run. So we only kept Claude for the final testing along with the two foundation models, because it's not easy to get results out of the others, right, automatically. When you feed something, it doesn't give us the results or the outputs. So they don't qualify. Maybe they could get better. Maybe the paid version is better, which is probably like what we have to test, put some money into it, and then test across the board to see if that improves the results in ChatGPT and Gemini. So we talked about this already, right? So, Grok had issues. It doesn't provide any files, and then often the file itself is incorrect, right, and fails to run. Perplexity was very interesting. It just looks like Perplexity is more an aggregator and not an LLM on its own. I don't know much about Perplexity, but Perplexity had a lot of issues. So the one thing with Claude, though, Claude still had challenges. So we had to give detailed prompting. So based on the data set, based on how things work, so this is where maybe we cheated a little bit, right? So Claude suggested a whole set of models, and then we subset that with some intelligent tuning, right? Not tuning, but prompting. So basically, we pre-selected some models, developed detailed prompt, because we know that Claude is able to produce the results at least, right? Look at the data, produce the results, give the visuals, make the comparison easy. So it's essentially doing AI work, right? Human work automatically. So we did subset about 8 models that it recommended. It ranked models based on the data set. right? It ranked about 12 models. So we picked 8 models, right? And most of them happened to be machine learning KNN models. So this is actually the only thing that we did to help Claude, right? So there is a small bias in the results, right? Because we did help subset the models. So at the end of the day, Claude did pick the models. It picked Ridge most of the time. 1/3 of the time it picked Ridge. 1/3 was KNN. And then a variety of other models, like XGBoost, the normal lasso, gradient boosting, extra trees. This is what Claude picked. So XGBoost was pretty good. Light GBM, I don't think it picked light GBM, I guess. We had light GBM in the mix, but I'm not sure. Maybe 1 or 2 SKUs were modeled with light GBM. So the final result, right? Obviously, Claude had a little bit of supervision. So basically, it's supervised AI. So we had helped Claude a little bit among the LLMs. But this work involves a little bit of work here, but again, it's rewarding because it is able to produce the forecast at scale. Because once you do this, you can actually forecast a large data set as well. And so we kept Chronos 2 times FM, and then we also kept a commercial package which was running Holt-Winters models, Holt-Winters and ARIMA models. So we used the commercial package, and we also used a tuned version of the commercial package. And the tuned version did slightly worse, largely because the planner was looking at the model fit graphically and picked models that made business sense, like our planner made business sense, instead of just sticking to the WMAP calculation, right? Just the accuracy calculation. So that way, I think that's one caveat, right? We don't want to just really decide everything just by the weighted MAPE, the final weighted MAPE number, or any type of accuracy metric, right? So that could be misleading. In fact, actually, when we had data with the inflection, when we did not really pass the entire series, we passed portions of the series with the inflection. Some of the models picked a trended model, and Chronos Bolt picked a flat model, and it outperformed everything else, right? Because the future was not known, right? So bottom line, what we have is the supervised AI did the best, right? Weighted MAPE across the 33 SKUs that we tested was about 10.8%, 89% accuracy, followed by times FM. So times FM is 12.8%, and Chronos 2 is 14%. So what is impressive is times FM, zero-shot forecasting. So you all know what zero-shot forecasting is. You do nothing. Put the data, just say, hey, produce a forecast for me, zero shot. So times FM from Google did pretty well, 12.8%. So that's actually very good because no effort here, and it was able to produce great results. Now, supervised AI did better. Again, automatic model generation. It involved some analyst effort. But some of the analyst effort from our side was more learning it, right? Learning about prompting, learning about subsetting, learning about creating a context model window, right? That type of stuff. So in the future, with some experience in AI, right, interacting with AI, creating an agent, so I think the effort would not be as much, and you can still produce pretty good forecasts, right? So that's what's impressive about using an LLM like Claude and creating an agentic framework to produce forecasts. So the commercial package did 13%. So basically the commercial package did pretty okay. I mean, what is expected is still acceptable forecast accuracy. And then the results in normalized RMSE are very similar, right? Not very different, but obviously slightly higher. So the results do not change much. And then we also reported across categories, right? These are the different subcategories. So if you think about the subcategories, supervised AI did the best across all categories. It just came in either first or second in 5 out of 8 categories. And times FM came out second, right? So depending on the pattern, depending on the complexity of the series, right? So the weighted MAPE, obviously is dominated by some of the high volume categories here, some of the high volume SKUs. So largely the supervised AI did much, much better, and Times FM did reasonably well, very well, given that it involves no effort at all. Okay? So I'm going to show you some, some graphical visuals, right, in terms of how the different models did. With all 8 categories combined, right? Just, I know it's kind of a crowded picture here. So we're comparing the 5 different models along with the history. The history is the purple line, right? When you take a closer look, right? When you take a closer look, some of these models are flat. I think in some cases the flat models win, although it may not really mimic the pattern. So that also tells us that we don't want to just hang our hat on the WMAP. So this is where I think when we have large data sets, we have to refine the methodology a little bit, right? We may have to come up with other better metrics to validate the model selection and the forecast. Because obviously if we have a 2,000 SKU data set, a human cannot just review each SKU, right? So, so additional work is needed in terms of how we can improve this, the prompt engineering. Okay? Now, in one case, Google Times FM did really poorly. It just over-forecasted the trend, right? And it came up with the weighted MAPE of 41%. So that was the only case where Times FM did not do well. And if you exclude that, Times FM performance even, improves a lot more, actually. So with all this, right, supervised AI did the best. Times FM did very well, coming in second. Commercial packages perform moderately, right? But the big deal here is, if you're using commercial package versus a foundation model like Times FM or with AI, you are simply able to get slightly better results. I mean, this is not a generalization. Obviously, it's based on just 2 or 3 data sets that we tested, right? Going forward, though, when you want to automate this, can the LLM replace forecasting packages? Or can the LLMs actually, replace forecasting function in the large, ERP systems, right? Really, that's a question. With the effort that's necessary, what can be done, right? So what we did was we said, well, we'll take a data set that's actually much more harmonized and cleansed. So we have a very forecastable data set from a food company, right? A large CPG food company, packaged food company, very forecastable. And typically, that company uses SAP APO, right? Has been a client of ours for a long time. And with the SAP APO, obviously, my modeling team does the tuning of the models, generate the forecast. Typically, we were able to turn in about 12% to 9% or 8% MAPE, WMAPE, at the SKU level, right? SKU location level. So really very, very good performance from SAP APO. Obviously not SAP APO best fit model. SAP APO custom tuned by a demand planner, right? So we took that forecasting data set. It's a very forecastable series, obviously. So we said, let's just evaluate that, right? Just to make sure what it does with a very forecastable data set, very, very forecastable data set. There were 55 SKUs in there, consistent trend and seasonality throughout the historical period. So the final results, the supervised AI scored 15.8%. Times FM scored 19%. This is very forecastable data. And the tuned SAP APO models did 14%, right? So really, if you think about very forecastable data set, it looks like the automated model loses its edge, right? The AI-based models, the LLM-based models lose their edge, right? The tuned, simple forecasting methods, SAP APO just uses Holt-Winters, right? It doesn't use anything else. It doesn't use ARIMA. It just uses Holt-Winters models, right? Exponential smoothing. And that does pretty well, like about 13, 14% on average. So, I mean, this calls into question a few things. Data cleansing, harmonized data, all of that, how does it impact the LLM work, right? Very forecastable versus unforecastable data. So should we just use a segmented approach where we say the long tail, unforecastable data, use LLMs, right? Agentic framework. And the forecastable data still try to have humans plan that data, right? I don't know. It's still kind of out in the open. We haven't really tested this further. So this was actually a surprising result, though. Okay. So finally, in conclusion, right, will AI replace forecasting software? Largely, still, it's questionable. I know there is this sensationalism, there is this fear and anxiety in the market. You have seen many software companies, their stocks got pummeled, right? They have lost anywhere between 70% and 90%. Most of the SaaS companies, software as a subscription-based model companies, right? Largely because of the fear that LLMs, specifically Claude or ChatGPT, will replace what these SaaS companies are providing as an offering, right? Software. At this point, at least when it comes to forecasting, LLMs can forecast, but cannot independently govern, validate, and operationalize them, right? And they are not like stable enterprise forecasting systems because you need a whole bunch of things for forecasting, from ETL, extracting the data, cleansing the data, and some of the cleansing is not automatic model outlier correction either. Some of the cleansing is based on business knowledge, based on a business prior. And they also require some precise prompts and structured inputs to generate usable outputs. So, but they seem to be a strong candidate to automate at least the forecasting function within the large ERP planning systems. You could just say, hey, create an agent. Now, one of the things that we experienced was some hallucination. So if you just give a prompt to even Claude, to produce a forecast with the data set A today, it'll produce something. And then 10 minutes later, you repeat the prompt, it produces slightly different models, slightly different forecasts. And you do it the following day with the same identical data, different forecasts. So then we learned we have to do some adjustments to Claude, including memory, right? So when it is part of the same prompt, or when there is memory enabled, when Claude remembers what was done, then the hallucination gets minimized. So obviously, you have to use an agentic framework. Now, obviously, your agentic framework, it means that you have to have a paid version of Claude, right? So in the future, it is quite possible an agentic framework, like a demand planning agent or a modeling agent, can actually replace the forecasting piece of the planning system. So you could actually have the demand agent or the statistical or the modeling agent produce the forecast, and then that forecast get populated through an agent into the planning system. That's quite possible. Because you have limitations in the commercial forecasting packages because they have a set of models, defined models, and ERPs, the large planning systems, also have a limited set of models only. And if you want additional models, you have to wait for an upgrade. That could be, a year with smaller companies, smaller software companies. It could be 5 years with SAP, right? SAP did APO back in the 90s, and then it came up with IBP in 2015. IBP has more models. Now, at least they have gotten their act together now. With IBP, every release, they are actually just increasing, putting some models in. Because, they're getting kicked right now because of the AI fears. So they are actually very prompt and they are upgrading models. So this could potentially be the pathway where LLMs, some with some supervision, some agentic development can actually replace the forecasting piece or the modeling piece because you have a large set of models available to LLMs, right? So the question is, will organizations, invest in? So the other thing is, what about times FM? What about foundation models? So will they invest in, tuning foundation models to get similar results? Because, obviously we used zero-shot forecasting. And will AI replace planners? Now, the first question, will replace forecasting software? Not the entire forecasting ecosystem, right? But it can potentially come close to replacing the forecasting module in planning systems, right? Potentially. Because with the advancements that's happening right now, Claude did not even release Fable or Mythos, right? Because they've been banned by the US government, so it's not available to, to the public. So what we have is Opus 4.8, I believe, right? Opus 4.8. So with the advancements, anything is possible, right? It is quite possible that, all you need is, an agentic framework and a working LLM, boom, your forecasting stuff is done. And all of you hardworking researchers at IIF and the academic universities everywhere, you are going to feed Claude with better, more advanced models, right? Because they are all open source, unless you decide to protect them too. So, which means it is actually going to be, it's going to be self-feeding, right? Claude is going to get better, or ChatGPT, or whoever it is, or Gemini. They're going to get better in producing forecasts because you have the universe of models available, and the models are only expanding. So it's really expanding almost. Claude releases a newer version almost every month, maybe, right? So I've seen from Opus 4.6 to 4.7 to 4.8 to Fable. Obviously, Fable is not released yet. So the question is, yes, possibly to a certain extent, right? Not the entire planning system, and not the bells and whistles, making overrides, adjustments, those type of things, or interconnectivity with other software systems. So that may be difficult, but the forecasting modeling function potentially could be, right? Will it replace planners? Probably not, right? Because planners are necessary even just in a folksy way to talk to the sales guy, right? Talk to marketing people, talk to finance people. I mean, I've seen agentic framework where there is a demand planning agent talking to a sales agent, talking to a supply planning agent, and maybe in the future they'll be talking to a CEO agent. So which means we don't really need humans anymore, right? That's possible, but that's really interesting vision. But we need that for the folksy stuff that happens in corporate America, right? We need humans. But on top of that, even to make AI work, to develop an agent, you need somebody who has some modeling knowledge, business knowledge, and also the ability to finesse the LLM, to create the agent, right? So which means I think this part is not going to be, obviously the answer is no. At least in my mind, the answer is no. But what is going to happen is the seasoned data scientists or demand planners with AI training, not necessarily statistical training. They don't have to know all of the stuff that you all know, right? But at least to understand different categories of models and what they do. What is the input? What is the output? I don't really care about the algorithm. I don't care about what it does. What is the mechanics? I don't care about all that. I know I give this input. This model gives me this type of output. I know these models exist, right? With such knowledge, business knowledge, and good training with AI, maybe these ones would replace the traditional demand planners, right? That are very good just with only business savvy, right? That is going to happen. So people with AI will have a leverage over people who either or not comfortable or just say no to AI, right? So that's going to happen, and that's coming very soon, I think, right? I heard a statistic, I don't know how true it is, that only 85% of the people don't use AI. That's what I heard. I don't know how true it is, right? That's very alarming. And in fact, I was part of the 85% until March of this year. So, my team tested all this stuff. I didn't use AI. But now I use AI for everything. I use Gemini for creating images, videos. It's unbelievable what Gemini can do with videos, and it's scary what Gemini can do. I can do things that are physically impossible for me with Gemini, right? I can be Superman. So I use Claude, I use ChatGPT for making proposals, legal agreements, all of that stuff that used to take time. I can write a proposal because I used to get really lazy about writing proposals. I'll be thinking about the sun and the earth and the mountains and all that stuff before completing a proposal, business proposal. But now it's like 5 minutes. I have the templates. I loaded all my proposals into Claude. I have written 1,000 proposals in the past. I loaded all of them into Claude and then just gave them the template, gave them the logo, all that stuff, and then just describe what I want in this particular proposal. Boom. The proposal ready within 10 minutes, right? And then I go in and make some changes. Obviously, it is going to just make some errors as well, right? I make some changes. So it's very, very quick, making proposals, making presentations. In fact, I had Claude actually proofread this presentation. It did make a few mistakes that I had to correct at the last minute, right? But it's fantastic. So which means that's the real key. People who are avoiding AI just because they don't like it or they're uncomfortable, if that is the case, I think they are ready to retire. They are ready to go to Greece and Cyprus and enjoy the vacation and close their eyes to AI, the evolution of AI. So where are we heading? So AI handles scale, complexity, speed, but humans provide judgment, accountability at the end of the day. Because keep in mind, though, AI could make these errors, the hallucination, the minor errors. AI would still make it, right? You still want to just review your proposal before sending it to the client. You still want to review the presentation before sending it to the CEO, right? You don't want to have an agent that sends a presentation to the CEO directly, right? Then you'll be fired. So short term, humans decide. AI executes and accelerates forecasting and planning, right? That speed is available now. So typically a new divide is happening. It will happen between AI-enhanced decision-making and those without AI leverage. And decision cycles are going to shrink. So I don't know how much, but a lot of it is going to happen as the AI adoption increases over time, right? Because now 85% of the people don't use AI. If it becomes 80% or 75%, then you have more people that are aware of AI and know AI. The irony is people who are least aware of AI, the C-suite, they are just telling people to spend 90% of their budget on AI only, right? That's one reason why software companies are suffering, because they don't want to invest in software. They don't want to invest in anything, any other initiative other than AI. It has to have an AI in it, right? At least it has to have a name AI in it. So basically, AI could be embedded in our workflows with humans in it, but not a replacement. So long term, AI systems become deeply embedded and more autonomous in operations, right? In day-to-day operations. So I think that's coming, but we don't know when, right? Maybe 10 years later, perhaps. So it's really futuristic at this point, right? So which means like the activities that we do are going to be minimized, right? So probably we do more thinking work. So which means how many people we need to think. So those are all kind of scary, alarming, futuristic thoughts. But what is going to happen is the productivity, right? If you could do what you did before in 10% of the time, so which means you're going to be productive. You're going to imagine a world that actually does a lot more than what we do right now. right? That's quite possible. Now, legacy systems could be replaced because, because of the performance at scale, legacy systems could be replaced across the board. We are only talking about forecasting here, but we could just have other systems that work across the board. Now, what AI empowers is the smaller companies will gain advantage over larger companies with AI. Things that are not reachable to the smaller companies are easy within reach, right? Or easy within reach. In fact, I just wrote a system with Claude Code. I'm not a big programmer. I used to program in SAS for a long time. A system to replace Jira for our company. So we use Jira and Monday for program management. So I just wrote this, push it on my deployment team, and it's working like a charm, and we can change it as much as we can. Similarly, I wrote a timesheet tracker for my company. It tracks timesheets as well as out of office for the employees. So, I can actually look at a dashboard to see this week who is working, who's not. And, so we got rid of the time tracking software. So these are things that are going to happen. The more and more you're creative, you're going to replace with custom software. And it's quite possible Intuit may go out of business, right? Because people can write custom financial software, accounting software that they need, right? They don't need all the complexity. So that's quite possible. So I think those are all happening with AI, right? And similarly, academics, you guys are on the cutting edge. You just do the latest models. But I don't have to go to school or get an enhanced PhD to learn what is out there, because I know my proxy, my agent Claude, actually has digested most of the models that you have developed, right, from an academic perspective. So which means this also narrows the gap between academics and practitioners as well, because practitioners can use what you're developing much more quickly. It's accessible quickly. We don't have to be glossy-eyed when you talk about, an advanced model, right? So that's where we are heading. I think it is a positive thing. It also minimizes the gap between the large and the small, between the accomplished academic and the simple, naive practitioner like myself, right? Because it just gives me more power to access those advanced models to leverage, for my task. I don't have to worry about hiring a, advanced academic researcher to develop a whole new model, right? So this is where my question is, with AI, with LLM, with paid agentic version, what is the comparison? What is the relevance? Not relevance, but how do foundation models compete? TimesFM did pretty well, 0 shot. And obviously, we haven't really worked on tuning or anything because it's very, very new to using foundation models, right? TimesFM did pretty well. So which means that really gives you, some power, leverage using foundation models. But if AI is doing well with a little bit of effort, then why do people invest in foundation models? I don't know, right? Since AI is capable of doing this. Foundation models obviously is satisfying because, we have all of the theory that's possible and that allows people to do forecasting with very little effort. But so does AI as well. Okay? Very good. That's all I have. Thank you. If you have any questions.
Questions from the audience?
So, very interesting, as always, Mark.
You always ask tough questions, but that's okay. Go ahead.
My observation has been that, first of all these large language models, even the proprietary ones, are trained mainly on the open source internet.
Open source?
Internet.
Right.
My observation is that a lot of the more advanced demand planning knowledge, for some reason, never made it out to the open source internet. Whether it was intentional or not, it stayed kind of in the collective mind of experienced demand planners, of consultants
Tribal
that have been doing this for a long time, but never really kind of percolated to blog posts and research papers. A very basic example of this is the number of blog posts or papers that discuss forecast management by exception is like minimum 1 or 2 at most, and very little information on how to do it properly. So how do you expect large language models that have not seen this tribal wisdom to be able to effectively make decisions?
Okay, very good question, yes. So we are now going just from a modeling framework to a demand planning framework. Now, I think it's quite possible, so you heard of the context model window, right? So you can develop the context model. So the tribal knowledge, obviously you have to document the tribal knowledge. You can develop that context model through feeding emails, posts, memos, what have you, into this, and potentially you could develop an agent that could improve the demand planning activities also, right? So it is, AI is not afraid of text. AI is not afraid of data. So you can throw in, I said, I put in 1,000 proposals into my context model, right, into that particular agent, into Cowork. So similarly with Cowork, you can actually just say, LLM basically shadows you on everything you do. So you have to set that up so that LLM can suggest, right, based on the model, based on the adjustments that you want to make, potentially you can make the LLM come back with an exception, with a suggestion on, there is going to be a promotion at CVS next week or a month from now. So, we think the forecast is, it's under forecasting the promotion based on the promotions that I've analyzed in the past, right? It is quite possible to do that. It could be chaotic. It needs a lot of intervention. It needs a detailed agent development. Potentially, we haven't done that, but I believe it's possible. But humans are needed, right? Humans are still needed to make sure that what information and to override what AI is coming up with. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you. So following actually this comment, my comment is, I work in commercial world in companies, and the best my model were never published. So LLM will not know about them. Any LLM will not know about it. So, I'm not academic, I'm not publishing everything.
I think I would like you to post it on a blog. LLM would not know about it, especially if your model is... if your model is really good and you have gotten very good results, then what you could do, if you want to leverage that along with the other universe of models, then in your own, AI instance, you create a memory feeding your specific model or the, or the paper, what have you, the white paper that you have. You feed that in there, and then LLM would just use the universe of all of the models out there that's published by all the academics, plus it'll use yours to answer questions for you. Obviously, you'll be selfish, but righteously so, because you developed it, and you want to use it for your own purpose. So which means you have an edge over others. So LLM would use it, but obviously it's private. So most of the, for example, enterprise LLMs, they keep your data private. So whatever you feed, my 1,000 proposals, my emails, that Claude Cowork is following me, they are all private to me. They are not in the, in the learning window, right? It doesn't learn or train based on what I do. It uses the open data, but then enhances it with my private intelligence to give me better answers. Thank you.
I think we should not miss one point. I will describe this in analogy. If you are a pilot as an airline, 90% of the time what you are doing during a flight is nearly nothing. It's done by a machine, by a computer. But in the start, in the landing, and in difficult intermediate situations when something is happening, then you have to have the full understanding of the underlying machinery. Otherwise, you cannot react consistently. So the point is similar here. If you only rely on the automaticity of the computers without having the deep understanding behind it, then you are lost in situations when this thing make crazy forecasts or decisions. So the point is, all this machinery, what you're describing there, should not decay the effort of the students to learn the real underlying methods, to learn the real underlying understanding. And unfortunately, I observe this often enough when I give lectures that they do only rely on the computers. You do not have to think yourself about it. This is something which should not happen, because then we will run in deep trouble.
Very true, very true. I think that's what academic institutions, colleges, universities are trying to enforce, that students don't use AI in their work, right? So it's important that the fundamental learning has to take place, right? Little kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, they just like question you, Dad, why should I learn addition, subtraction, right? I have a calculator. You already gave me an iPad. And then you just like slap their wrist and say, you better learn it, buddy. So how to add numbers, how to subtract numbers, how to divide and multiply numbers. So those foundational growth experiences, are necessary, and same is the case with academics as well, right? So they can use some things that are repetitive with AI, like we let them use calculators, right? So when I was a finance student, I was doing Black-Scholes. I mean, I knew how to derive Black-Scholes. I know how to derive the option price, but I'm not going to do it by hand for every option price, right? So obviously there are calculators that does Black-Scholes, because the assumption is I know this, right? I have done this, and I have derived Black-Scholes, so I can use Black-Scholes to calculate the option price. But since I know it, I can use a calculator, right, or a computer to do this. So it all depends on, how repetitive something is, how massive the data is, where computers can help. But I agree with you. You need to know this before you can just say, I'm going to depend on automation. And definitely you don't want to use in critical systems like, secure cybersecurity or flying a plane, right? I mean, it seems like forecasting is the easiest use case, because as forecasters, we already know our forecasts are bullshit, right? We already know that forecasts are incorrect. We are okay with the errors. So which means with the errors that we have, oh yeah, sure, LLM is okay, right? If it makes a little bit more error, we can help it. We can train it. So, question.
Thank you. In your tests, you use mostly weighted MAPE for the accuracy.
Correct.
But we're asked to also use bias, and also if you're over forecasting, under forecasting, and also something they do pay a lot of attention is what we call the shape or the trend.
Sorry?
The shape or the trend.
Right.
Right. So we have more than one evaluation metric. Have you done any tests and doing those other combination of beyond weighted MAPE, or still early in your process?
Okay, that's a good question. So the question is about whether we are using bias or whether we are using something about trend, right? No, we haven't done that. We just pretty much predicated everything on WMAPE, so it has some challenges. We just need to test the other measures as well. Because it was very clear, even though the WMAPE was lower, some of the model results, they did not have a good pattern, right? They did not exactly pick the pattern. That's the reason why when our demand planner tuned the model, they got slightly worse MAPE, but the model was much better, right? So, yeah, good point. I think that's something that we have to stress test, and we have to expand, yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. What is your intuitive feel for the number of forecasters that will be required as we go forward in the future? And obviously, humans will stay in the loop, but how many humans do we really need to do the forecasting load worldwide? That's a pretty good question. How many forecasters do we need?
I know Procter & Gamble once came to us from Procter & Gamble, India. A few years ago, they came to us and they asked us if we can supply 200 demand planners for their Mumbai office, because they outsourced most of the demand planning from the US to India. And then suddenly they have these 200 seats, but they don't have bodies, right? So as it is, I think some of the demand planning functions are being outsourced, and we are okay with training people, outsourcing to the Philippines or to India, Bangladesh, that type of stuff, where we realize that we don't really need advanced mathematical skills or advanced skills in demand planning or business judgment. But most of this is like back office work, right? So to me, the demand planning jobs that are being done on a routine fashion, they would get automated through LLMs. I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to insource some of this with agentic framework. But overall, given the productivity, given the improvement in accuracy, as business expands, I would think there is more need for humans, right? Intelligent humans, data scientists. So the big risk is ones that are doing routine demand planning. Just day in and day out, they do the same thing. I think they should think about retiring. So, but I would think that I don't really think there is a risk to those who are ready to use AI, ready to use modeling, and ready to kind of expand their skill set. So, and there is going to be a shortage of people when it comes to, those with the data science knowledge plus training in AI.
Hey, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.